When my sister-in-law Victoria slammed her wineglass down at the family dinner table and screamed, "You're nothing but a plague on this family, Elena! Everything falls apart the moment you walk through the door." I smiled quietly and took another sip of my water, knowing that in exactly 72 hours I would be signing the papers that would strip away every penny of the trust fund that had been keeping her lifestyle afloat for the past decade. What she didn't know was that I had just inherited complete control over the Castellano family fortune, and I was about to show them exactly what a real plague looked like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Castellano, and at 34 years old, I had spent the better part of my adult life being treated like the family disappointment, the black sheep, who somehow managed to ruin every gathering simply by existing. Standing in my brother Antonio's sprawling mansion in the hills of Marin County, surrounded by relatives who had made it their mission to remind me of my failures at every opportunity, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting even. 6 months earlier, my life had been dramatically different. I was living quietly in a small apartment in Oakland, working as a high school art teacher, and spending my evenings painting in the converted garage studio I rented from my elderly landlord, Mr. Rodriguez. My days were filled with teenagers who actually appreciated my passion for creativity, and my nights were peaceful solitude, where I could lose myself in colors and canvases that never judged me for not being successful enough, wealthy enough, or ambitious enough to meet my family's impossible standards. I had deliberately chosen a modest life after graduating from art school, preferring the satisfaction of inspiring young minds over the corporate ladder climbing that my family valued above all else. My salary was enough to cover my basic needs, and I had a small emergency fund that gave me security without extravagance. Most importantly, I had peace. My apartment was my sanctuary, decorated with my own artwork and thrift store finds that reflected my personality rather than some designer's vision of what success should look like. The Castellano family had built their fortune over 3 generations through strategic real estate investments and a chain of upscale restaurants throughout Northern California. My grandfather, Giuseppe Castellano, had arrived from Italy with nothing but determination and a recipe for the most incredible marinara sauce anyone had ever tasted. He built the first restaurant with his own hands, working 18-hour days until he could afford to hire help, then expanding slowly and methodically until he owned a small empire. My father, Marco Castellano, had inherited not only the business acumen but also the iron will that came with building something from nothing. He expanded the restaurant chain and diversified into commercial real estate, accumulating wealth that seemed almost magical to a child who watched him command respect wherever he went. But with that success came expectations, rigid, unforgiving expectations about what it meant to be a Castellano. My older brother Antonio had embraced those expectations completely. He joined the family business straight out of college, married Victoria, a woman whose social connections complemented his ambitions perfectly, and produced 2 children who are already being groomed for future leadership roles, despite being only 8 and 10 years old. Antonio lived in a 6,000-square-foot house with a view of the San Francisco Bay, drove cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and wore suits that were tailored to perfection. My younger sister Isabella had taken a different but equally approved path. She married Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a successful plastic surgeon whose practice catered to wealthy clients seeking to maintain their youth and beauty. Isabella herself had become something of a social media influencer, documenting her luxurious lifestyle and promoting high-end products to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She lived in a modern architectural masterpiece in Sausalito, complete with an infinity pool and a wine cellar that had been featured in lifestyle magazines. Then there was me, Elena, the family disappointment who had chosen teaching over business, art over ambition, authenticity over appearance. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that I maintained myself, shopped at Target instead of designer boutiques, and spent my vacations camping in state parks rather than flying to European resorts. To my family, I was living proof that the Castellano work ethic had somehow skipped a generation, at least in my case. The family gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable over the years, as the wealth gap between my siblings and me continued to widen. Every conversation seemed designed to highlight my modest circumstances. Every comment contained subtle digs about my choices, and every invitation felt more like an obligation than a genuine desire for my company. I had started declining most of these events, preferring to spend holidays alone with a good book and take out Chinese food rather than enduring hours of thinly veiled criticism about my lifestyle. But my father's 70th birthday party had not been optional. Marco Castellano expected his entire family to celebrate this milestone. An absence would have been interpreted as the ultimate disrespect. So I had carefully chosen an outfit that was appropriate but not expensive, brought a thoughtful gift that reflected my budget constraints, and prepared myself mentally for an evening of feeling like an outsider in my own family. The party was held at Antonio's house, naturally, since it was the most impressive venue, and Victoria loved any excuse to show off her interior design skills and catering connections. The guest list included not only family members but also business associates, political connections, and social elite who represented the circles my family moved in. I knew perhaps a dozen people at the party, and most of them greeted me with the polite but distant courtesy reserved for family members who don't quite fit the mold. Victoria had outdone herself with the decorations and menu, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a corporate gala than a family celebration. Everything was perfectly coordinated, from the floral arrangements to the color scheme to the waitstaff uniforms. The bar featured top-shelf liquors and wines that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The food was catered by one of the family restaurants, but elevated to fine dining standards that would impress even the most sophisticated palates. I had arrived exactly on time, bearing a gift I had carefully selected, a vintage photograph of my grandfather's original restaurant that I had found in an antique shop and had professionally framed. It was meaningful without being expensive, thoughtful without being showy, and I hoped it would demonstrate that I understood what was truly important about our family legacy, even if I hadn't chosen to pursue wealth in the traditional way. The evening had started well enough. My father seemed genuinely pleased with my gift, studying the photograph with the kind of nostalgic smile that suggested he was remembering his own childhood, and the stories his father had told about those early days of struggle and determination. For a brief moment, I felt like I belonged, like my perspective and my values had something meaningful to contribute to our family narrative. But as the wine flowed and the crowd grew more animated, the familiar patterns began to emerge. Antonio held court near the fireplace, regaling business associates with stories about his latest acquisition and his plans for expanding into Southern California markets. Isabella posed for Instagram photos with various groups of guests, her perfectly applied makeup and designer dress creating the kind of content that would generate thousands of likes and comments from her followers. Victoria moved through the party like a social conductor, orchestrating conversations and ensuring that every detail of the evening reflected well on her role as hostess, and on Antonio's status as the successful son. She introduced me to people with the kind of perfunctory politeness that made it clear I was being included out of obligation rather than enthusiasm, and her descriptions of my career always sounded apologetic, as if teaching high school art was something that required explanation or excuse. The turning point came during dinner, when the conversation naturally shifted to family updates and future plans. Antonio announced that he was considering opening a restaurant in Las Vegas, a move that would require significant capital investment but promised substantial returns given the city's tourism industry and the family's established reputation for quality. Isabella shared news about a sponsorship deal with a luxury skincare company that would involve her traveling to Europe for a photo shoot and promotional campaign. When the attention turned to me, I mentioned that I was excited about a new mural project my students were working on, a community art installation that would beautify an underpass in Oakland, while giving kids a chance to express their creativity and take pride in their neighborhood. The response was polite, but lukewarm, the kind of acknowledgement you give to someone who's enthusiastic about something you don't particularly understand or value. My cousin Marco Jr., Antonio's son, who worked in the family business and was clearly being groomed as the next generation of leadership, made a comment about how nice it must be to have a hobby that felt meaningful, even if it didn't provide financial security. The word hobby stung, reducing my career and my passion to something frivolous and inconsequential, but I managed to respond graciously, explaining that teaching provided both personal satisfaction and stable income, even if it wasn't as lucrative as other career paths. That's when Victoria, who had been drinking steadily throughout the evening and seemed increasingly irritated by what she perceived as the family's excessive politeness toward my modest achievements, decided to voice what she had apparently been thinking for years. Her comment about me being a plague on the family came after I had shared a story about one of my students, a young woman from a difficult background who had discovered a talent for painting and was now planning to apply to art schools. The story had been meant to illustrate why I found my work meaningful, why making a difference in individual lives felt more valuable to me than accumulating wealth or status. But Victoria had interpreted it differently, apparently seeing it as yet another example of my failure to understand what really mattered in life, my inability to appreciate the importance of financial success and social standing. Her words echoed across the suddenly silent dining room, creating the kind of uncomfortable moment that makes everyone wish they were anywhere else. The guests who weren't family members looked embarrassed to witness such a personal attack, while my relatives seemed torn between shock at Victoria's directness and relief that someone had finally said what they had all been thinking. My father looked genuinely upset, not necessarily because he disagreed with Victoria's sentiment, but because such family conflicts weren't supposed to be aired in front of business associates and social connections. Antonio appeared mortified by his wife's outburst, clearly calculating the social and professional damage of having hosted an event where family drama overshadowed the celebration. Isabella busied herself with her phone, probably already crafting social media posts that would present a carefully edited version of the evening that excluded any unpleasantness. But I just smiled and took another sip of my water, feeling strangely calm, despite the humiliation and hurt that should have overwhelmed me in that moment. Because 3 days earlier, I had received a phone call that had changed everything, though nobody in my family knew it yet. My great-aunt Francesca, my grandfather's younger sister, who had never married, and had spent her life quietly accumulating wealth through shrewd investments and careful living, had passed away at the age of 89. Aunt Francesca had been the family member I was closest to, the one person who had never made me feel inadequate for choosing passion over profit. She had attended my art school graduation, bought several of my paintings over the years, and sent me encouraging cards whenever I achieved something she thought was meaningful, whether it was a successful student exhibition or recognition from my school district for innovative teaching methods. What I hadn't known, what none of us had known, was that Aunt Francesca had been far wealthier than anyone imagined. Her modest lifestyle and unassuming demeanor had concealed an investment portfolio worth over $40 million, accumulated through decades of careful financial planning and a genius-level understanding of market trends. She had lived simply not because she had to, but because she chose to, finding satisfaction in security rather than display. The phone call from her attorney had informed me that I was the sole beneficiary of her estate, inheriting not only her substantial financial assets, but also the legal authority to make decisions about the family trust that provided monthly stipends to my siblings and their families. Aunt Francesca had apparently been observing our family dynamics for years, watching how my relatives treated me and drawing her own conclusions about who deserved to inherit the fruits of the Castellano family's original hard work and values. Her will included a letter addressed specifically to me, explaining her decision and providing guidance about how she hoped I would use the inheritance. She had written about watching me choose integrity over convenience, authenticity over approval, and meaningful work over easy money. She had praised my commitment to education and community service, values that she felt reflected the best aspects of our grandfather's character, rather than the materialistic focus that had consumed the younger generations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
But more than the money, Aunt Francesca had given me something even more valuable: the power to hold my family accountable for their treatment of me. The trust fund that supported my siblings' lifestyles was structured in a way that gave the primary beneficiary, now me, complete discretionary control over distributions. I could continue the payments as they had been, modify them based on circumstances or behavior, or terminate them entirely if I deemed it appropriate. As I sat at that dinner table listening to Victoria's verbal attack, knowing that her designer clothes, her luxury car, and her country club membership were all subsidized by money that I now controlled, I felt a sense of poetic justice that was almost overwhelming. She was calling me a plague, while being completely dependent on my newly inherited generosity for the lifestyle that gave her the confidence to look down on others. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of awkward conversations and meaningful glances between family members who weren't sure how to interpret Victoria's outburst, or my surprisingly calm reaction to it. I finished my dinner, participated politely in the cake ceremony and gift opening, and left at an appropriate time with gracious thanks to my hosts and warm wishes for my father's continued health and happiness. But as I drove home through the winding roads that separated my brother's wealthy neighborhood from my modest apartment, I was already making plans. I had 72 hours before my appointment with Aunt Francesca's attorney to finalize the inheritance paperwork and assume control of the family trust. 72 hours to decide exactly how I wanted to handle the power that had been placed in my hands. The decision wasn't difficult. My family had made it clear over years of gatherings, comments, and attitudes that they saw me as a burden, a disappointment, a plague on their carefully constructed image of success and sophistication. They had tolerated my presence out of obligation, while making sure I understood that my values and choices were inferior to theirs. They had accepted my modest gifts while giving me expensive items that highlighted our financial disparities. They had listened politely to my stories, while sharing their own achievements in ways that emphasized how much more important their work was than mine. Victoria's comment had simply been the most honest expression of what they all felt. I was a plague on their family. Someone whose presence reminded them that not everyone shared their priorities. Someone whose contentment with a simple life challenged their assumptions about what mattered. If that's how they wanted to see me, then I would give them exactly what they expected. I would be the plague that destroyed their comfortable financial security. I would be the plague that forced them to experience the anxiety and uncertainty that came with genuine financial vulnerability. I would be the plague that taught them the difference between earning respect and expecting it, between building character and buying status. The attorney's office was located in a gleaming downtown San Francisco high-rise, the kind of building where serious money was managed by serious people who understood the complexities of wealth preservation and transfer. James Morrison had been Aunt Francesca's advisor for over 20 years, and he greeted me with the respectful professionalism of someone who had helped many families navigate the emotional and practical challenges of significant inheritance. The paperwork was extensive, but straightforward. I signed documents transferring ownership of investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business interests that I was still struggling to comprehend fully. The numbers were staggering. More money than I had ever imagined having. More than I could spend in several lifetimes, even if I adopted the extravagant lifestyle my family favored. But the most important document was the trust modification that gave me complete control over the monthly distributions that had been supporting my siblings for years. Antonio received $15,000 per month, money that helped cover his mortgage, car payments, and country club dues. Isabella received $12,000 per month, funds that supplemented her husband's medical practice income and allowed her to maintain the lifestyle she documented so carefully on social media. Even Victoria, through her marriage to Antonio, was indirectly benefiting from money that now flowed through my decisions. Her shopping budget, her spa treatments, her luxury vacations were all subsidized by the trust fund that I could modify or terminate with a simple written notice to the financial management company. Your aunt was very specific about her intentions, Mr. Morrison explained as we reviewed the final documents. She wanted you to have complete discretionary authority over these distributions. She felt that the recipients had become too comfortable with money they hadn't earned, and too dismissive of family members who had chosen different paths. I asked him about the legal implications of modifying or terminating the trust payments, wanting to understand exactly what options were available and what protections existed to prevent my decisions from being challenged or overturned. The structure was ironclad. Aunt Francesca had worked with the best legal minds to ensure that her wishes would be carried out exactly as she intended. The recipients have no legal right to continued payments, he explained. The distributions have always been discretionary, dependent on the primary beneficiary's assessment of need and merit. Your aunt was very clear that she wanted you to use your judgment about who deserved continued support based on their behavior and values. I left the attorney's office feeling simultaneously overwhelmed by the responsibility and energized by the possibilities. For the first time in my adult life, I had real power in my family relationships, not the power that comes from wealth or status, but the power that comes from controlling something that other people wanted and needed. The drive back to Oakland gave me time to plan my approach. I could simply terminate all the trust payments immediately, shocking my family with sudden financial hardship and forcing them to confront the reality of their dependence on inherited wealth. Or I could be more strategic, using the threat of termination to demand changes in behavior, apologies for past treatment, and genuine efforts to rebuild our relationships on more equitable terms. But as I thought about Victoria's words and the years of condescension and dismissal I had endured, I realized that neither approach felt satisfying. My family's problems weren't just about money. They were about character, values, and the way they treated people they perceived as less successful than themselves. Simply taking away their financial support wouldn't teach them anything meaningful, and demanding apologies would likely result in insincere performances designed to restore their access to money, rather than genuine recognition of how they had failed as family members. Instead, I decided on a third approach. I would let them reveal their true characters by allowing their financial security to slowly disappear while observing how they responded to increasing pressure and uncertainty. I would reduce their payments gradually, forcing them to make difficult choices about their lifestyles, while watching to see whether adversity brought out their better angels or simply made them more desperate and manipulative. It would be a long-term experiment in human nature, a test of whether my family members were capable of growth and change when their comfortable assumptions about wealth and status were challenged. And if they failed that test, if they proved themselves to be exactly as shallow and materialistic as their treatment of me suggested, then I would have no moral obligation to continue supporting lifestyles that were fundamentally corrupt. The first payment reduction was scheduled to take effect in 2 weeks. I decided to cut each sibling's monthly distribution by 25% without warning or explanation, letting them discover the change when they reviewed their bank statements. The reductions wouldn't create immediate financial crisis, but they would be significant enough to require adjustments in spending and lifestyle choices. I was curious to see how long it would take them to notice the changes, whether they would contact me directly or try to resolve the issue through other family members, and what explanations they would construct for the reduced payments. Most importantly, I wanted to observe whether financial pressure would make them more grateful for what they still had or more demanding about what they felt they deserved. As I prepared for bed that night in my modest apartment, surrounded by my own artwork and the simple possessions that reflected my actual income and values, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with justice. Tomorrow I would continue teaching my students about creativity and self-expression. I would help them understand that art had value beyond market price, that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with bank account balances. But I would also begin the process of teaching my family a different kind of lesson about value, respect, and the consequences of taking people for granted. They had called me a plague on their family, someone whose presence disrupted their comfortable assumptions about superiority and success. Now I would show them what a real plague looked like. Not the kind that destroyed through violence or cruelty, but the kind that revealed truth by stripping away illusions and forcing people to confront the reality of their own character. Victoria had no idea that her cruel words at my father's birthday party had signed her financial death warrant. Antonio had no idea that his years of condescending comments about my career choices had cost him the comfortable lifestyle he had come to consider his birthright. Isabella had no idea that her social media posts, celebrating luxury funded by family money, had been carefully documented as evidence of her priorities and values. They were about to discover that sometimes the family member you dismiss as powerless is actually the one holding all the cards. They were about to learn that respect can't be bought, character can't be inherited, and family loyalty is earned through behavior, not claimed through blood relationships. I was Elena Castellano, the family plague, and I was about to show them exactly what happens when you take the wrong person for granted. The first sign that my plan was working came exactly 14 days later, when my phone buzzed with a text message from Isabella at 7:30 in the morning. The message was carefully worded, maintaining her usual cheerful social media tone while clearly fishing for information about what she obviously saw as a banking error. Hey sis, hope you're having a great week. Quick question, do you know anything about the family trust stuff? I think there might be some kind of mistake with this month's transfer. Nothing urgent, just wanted to check if anyone else noticed anything weird. Love you. I read the message while sipping coffee in my kitchen, watching the morning sun filter through the windows of my apartment, and feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with watching my family's assumptions crumble in real time. Isabella's carefully casual tone couldn't disguise the underlying anxiety. She had clearly spent considerable time crafting that message to sound unconcerned, while desperately seeking reassurance that her comfortable income stream hadn't been disrupted. Instead of responding immediately, I decided to let her wonder for a while. One of the most valuable lessons I had learned from years of being dismissed by my family was the power of silence, of letting other people fill the void with their own fears and assumptions rather than rushing to provide comfort or explanation. Isabella was probably expecting a quick response, maybe even some sympathy about banking complications or administrative confusion. Instead, she would get nothing, forcing her to sit with uncertainty and begin questioning whether her financial security was as guaranteed as she had always assumed. The second indication that my strategy was effective came 3 days later, when Antonio called during my lunch break at school. I was sitting in my classroom, grading student artwork and enjoying the peaceful quiet that came with having 30 minutes to myself, when his name appeared on my phone screen. Antonio rarely called me directly, preferring to communicate through family group text or brief conversations at gatherings, so the phone call itself was significant. "Elena, hey, it's Antonio," he began, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency he used for business conversations. "I wanted to touch base with you about something financial. Have you heard anything from Dad or anyone else about changes to the family trust arrangements?" His directness surprised me. Unlike Isabella's carefully crafted text message, Antonio was approaching the situation with the straightforward manner of someone accustomed to solving problems through direct communication. But beneath his business-like tone, I could detect a note of concern that suggested he was taking the payment reduction more seriously than his sister was. "I haven't heard anything specific," I replied truthfully. "Is there something you're concerned about?" "Well, there seems to be a discrepancy in this month's distribution. Nothing major, but enough to notice. I thought maybe there was some kind of administrative change or tax adjustment that we should know about." The word discrepancy was interesting. It suggested that Antonio was still thinking in terms of errors rather than intentional modifications. He was giving the financial management company the benefit of the doubt, assuming that reduced payments were mistakes rather than deliberate decisions made by someone with the authority to make them. "That does sound confusing," I agreed. "Have you tried contacting the trust administrators directly?" "I've left a message with the management company, but they haven't gotten back to me yet. I was hoping maybe Dad had mentioned something about restructuring or changes in the trust terms." I could hear the frustration in his voice as he described his attempts to get information from the very people who were now required to follow my instructions rather than his expectations. The power dynamic had shifted completely, though he didn't understand that yet. For years, Antonio had been accustomed to receiving explanations and accommodations whenever he had questions about financial matters. Now he was discovering what it felt like to be kept in the dark, while others made decisions that affected his life. "I'm sure it will get sorted out," I said with the kind of reassuring confidence that people offer when they know exactly what's happening but have no intention of explaining it. These administrative things usually resolve themselves pretty quickly. After ending the call, I sat in my empty classroom thinking about the different ways my siblings were processing the same information. Isabella was approaching the situation with social anxiety, worried about appearances and hoping to resolve the issue quietly without admitting that she monitored her trust payments closely enough to notice a reduction immediately. Antonio was treating it as a business problem, assuming that direct communication and logical inquiry would provide answers and solutions. Neither of them had considered the possibility that the payment changes were intentional, authorized by someone with legitimate authority to make such modifications. They were both operating under the assumption that their monthly distributions were guaranteed, that the trust existed to serve their needs rather than reflect someone else's judgment about their worthiness to receive inherited wealth. The third family member to react was, surprisingly, Victoria. Her approach was characteristically dramatic and completely lacking in the subtle maneuvering that her husband and sister-in-law had employed. She called me on a Friday evening while I was at home working on a painting, and her voice was tight with barely controlled anger from the first words she spoke. Elena, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this needs to stop right now. Her directness caught me off guard, not because I was unprepared for confrontation, but because she seemed to understand intuitively what Antonio and Isabella had missed. Somehow, Victoria had connected the timing of the payment reductions to my presence at the birthday party and my reaction to her public humiliation of me. She might not understand the mechanics of how I had gained control over their finances, but she clearly suspected that I was involved in their current difficulties. I'm not sure what you're referring to, I replied calmly, setting down my paintbrush and giving her my full attention. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss? Don't play dumb with me. The trust payments got cut this month, and I know it's connected to you somehow. Maybe you complained to your father about what happened at the party. Maybe you're trying to cause problems for Antonio's family. But whatever you're doing, it needs to stop. Her accusation was fascinating in its combination of accuracy and complete misunderstanding. She was right that I was responsible for the payment reductions, and she was right that my actions were connected to the birthday party incident. But she was completely wrong about my motivations and methods. She seemed to think I was engaging in family politics, perhaps manipulating my father or other relatives to punish her for her public attack on me. The idea that I might have independent power over their financial situation hadn't occurred to her. In Victoria's worldview, someone like me, unsuccessful, modest, financially dependent, couldn't possibly have the resources or authority to affect the lives of people like her. She was looking for conspiracies and manipulations because she couldn't imagine that I might simply have more power than she realized. I think there might be some confusion here, I said carefully. I don't have any involvement in trust administration or family financial decisions. If you're having concerns about banking issues, you should probably contact the management company directly. Banking issues, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Right. This is about what I said at the party, isn't it? You're trying to get back at me by causing financial problems for Antonio and Isabella. Her assumption that I would use underhanded methods to seek revenge was revealing. It suggested that Victoria herself would employ such tactics if she had the opportunity, that she viewed family relationships as strategic competitions where victory was achieved through manipulation and sabotage, rather than honest communication and mutual respect. Victoria, I understand you're frustrated about financial concerns, but I really don't have any influence over those matters. Maybe this is just a coincidence that will resolve itself when the administrators review their procedures. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Victoria alternating between accusations and demands for confession, while I maintained polite denial and expressed sympathy for her stress about the situation. By the time she hung up, clearly unsatisfied with my responses but unable to extract any admission of responsibility, I was even more convinced that my approach was the right one. Victoria's reaction had revealed something important about how my family viewed me and my place in their hierarchy. Even when confronted with evidence that I might have some power over their circumstances, she couldn't conceptualize me as someone capable of independent action or legitimate authority. Her immediate assumption was that I must be working through other people, manipulating family dynamics or exploiting personal relationships to achieve my goals. The idea that I might have inherited substantial wealth and legal control over their financial support was so far outside her understanding of who I was supposed to be that she couldn't even consider it as a possibility. This blind spot would work in my favor as I continued to implement my plan, allowing me to operate with relative freedom while they searched for explanations that fit their preconceived notions about my capabilities and resources. Over the following weeks, I observed my family's adjustment to their reduced circumstances, with the detached interest of a researcher studying behavioral responses to environmental changes. The 25% reduction in their monthly payments wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant enough to require modifications in their spending patterns and lifestyle choices. Isabella's social media posts became subtly different, featuring fewer luxury purchases and expensive restaurant meals. She began promoting more affordable products and services, shifting her influencer brand toward accessible luxury and smart shopping rather than pure extravagance. Her engagement with followers increased as she shared tips for finding designer items at discount prices and highlighted affordable alternatives to high-end products. The change was clever and probably beneficial for her brand in the long term, but it also revealed how quickly she had recognized the need to adjust her image to match her new financial reality. Instead of acknowledging that her lifestyle had been partially subsidized by family money, she was reframing her situation as a conscious choice to be more relatable and practical. Antonio's adjustments were more dramatic and less successfully concealed. He began working longer hours, taking on additional clients, and expanding his role in the family restaurant business to generate more personal income. His conversations at family gatherings shifted from confident pronouncements about expansion plans to more cautious discussions about market conditions and the importance of careful financial management. Most tellingly, he and Victoria began hosting fewer social events and attending fewer expensive gatherings. Their country club membership remained active, but they were clearly being more selective about optional expenses, like golf lessons, spa treatments, and premium dining experiences. The changes weren't impoverishing them, but they were forcing them to make choices they hadn't needed to make before. Victoria's behavior became increasingly erratic as the financial pressure continued. She seemed to be taking the reduced payments as a personal attack, and her interactions with other family members became strained as she searched for someone to blame for their changed circumstances. During one family dinner at our father's house, she made several pointed comments about the importance of family loyalty and the danger of allowing outsiders to influence family decisions. Her comments were clearly directed at me, though she was careful not to make direct accusations that might provoke a confrontation. Instead, she spoke in generalities about family members who didn't understand business pressures, who judged others for their success, and who might be willing to sacrifice family unity for personal vindication. I listened to her veiled attacks with the same calm expression I had maintained throughout our previous interactions, offering no response that would either confirm or deny her suspicions. My silence seemed to frustrate her even more than active denial would have, because it forced her to continue speculating without any feedback about whether her theories were accurate. Meanwhile, my own life continued along its usual patterns, with one significant difference. I now had the resources to make choices based purely on preference rather than financial constraint. I upgraded my apartment to a larger space with better light for painting, enrolled in graduate art courses that I had always wanted to take, and began planning a summer trip to Europe to study classical art techniques. These changes were modest compared to the lifestyle my family was accustomed to, but they represented freedom and possibility in ways that felt more valuable than any amount of luxury spending. I was living according to my own values, while having the security of knowing that I could afford whatever I might need in the future. The most interesting development came when my father requested a private meeting with me. Marco Castellano rarely involved himself directly in family conflicts, preferring to let his children resolve their own disputes while maintaining his role as the respected patriarch whose approval everyone sought. But the ongoing tension around the trust payments had apparently reached a level that required his intervention. We met for lunch at one of the family restaurants, a midweek appointment that allowed us to talk privately without the social complications of a family gathering. My father looked older than I remembered, perhaps weighed down by the stress of trying to understand why his family's financial stability had become uncertain without any clear explanation or resolution. "Elena, I wanted to talk with you about some concerns that have been raised about the family trust," he began after we had ordered our meals. "Antonio and Isabella seem to think there have been some changes in the payment structure, and Victoria has suggested that there might be some kind of family conflict affecting the administration." His approach was diplomatic, presenting the situation as a puzzle that needed solving rather than a problem that needed blaming. But I could see the worry in his eyes as he tried to understand what was happening to the financial security he had worked so hard to provide for his children. "I've heard them mention some concerns," I acknowledged. "It sounds like they're having difficulties getting information from the trust administrators. Have you noticed any changes in your own situation? Any communications from the management company or legal representatives?" The question was asked casually, but I understood its significance. My father was trying to determine whether I was being affected by the same issues that were troubling my siblings, or whether there was something different about my circumstances that might explain the discrepancies. "I haven't been receiving trust payments," I said truthfully, "so I wouldn't necessarily know about administrative changes that only affected active distributions." This was technically accurate, I hadn't been receiving payments before inheriting control of the trust, and I wasn't receiving them now since I was managing the entire fund rather than drawing monthly stipends from it. But my father interpreted my response as confirmation that I was outside the financial arrangements that were causing problems for Antonio and Isabella. I see, he said thoughtfully. I've been trying to contact Francesca's old attorney to get some clarification about the trust structure, but he's been difficult to reach. The whole situation is quite confusing. The mention of Aunt Francesca's attorney was interesting. It suggested that my father was beginning to suspect that her death might be connected to the changes in trust administration. But he was clearly thinking in terms of legal complications or administrative transitions, rather than considering the possibility that she might have restructured the trust entirely before her death. These legal matters can be very complex, I agreed, especially when there are multiple beneficiaries and different types of distributions involved. Elena, I want you to know that if you're experiencing any financial difficulties, if there's anything you need that we can help with, you should feel comfortable coming to the family. I know we haven't always been as supportive as we should have been of your career choices, but you're my daughter and your welfare is important to me. His offer was touching and completely sincere, revealing a side of my father that rarely emerged during family gatherings dominated by business discussions and social posturing. For a moment, I felt genuine affection for this man who had worked so hard to build security for his family, even if his definition of success and mine had never quite aligned. I appreciate that, Dad. I really do. I'm actually doing quite well right now. My teaching position is stable, and I've been able to pursue some personal projects that are very fulfilling. Good. I'm glad to hear that. I worry sometimes that we haven't done enough to make sure all of our children feel valued and supported. His words carried a weight of recognition that suggested he was beginning to understand how his focus on traditional markers of success might have made me feel excluded or undervalued. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from him, and it came at a moment when I was literally holding the power to resolve his other children's financial concerns with a simple phone call. The irony was overwhelming. Here was my father, offering me support and expressing regret about the family's treatment of me, while remaining completely unaware that I now controlled the very financial resources that were causing him so much worry about Antonio and Isabella's welfare. Family relationships are complicated, I said carefully. But I think the most important thing is that we continue to care about each other and support each other through difficult times. Exactly. Whatever is happening with these trust issues, we'll figure it out together. Family comes first, and we take care of our own. As lunch concluded, and we prepared to part ways, my father's words echoed in my mind with bitter irony. Family comes first, and we take care of our own. These were exactly the values that my siblings had failed to demonstrate when they treated me as a burden and an embarrassment. These were the principles that Victoria had abandoned when she publicly attacked me for not meeting their standards of success and ambition. Now they were discovering what it felt like to need support from family members, to experience uncertainty about their financial security, to worry about whether their comfortable assumptions about the future were justified. The difference was that I actually had the power to help them, whereas they had simply chosen not to include me in their definition of family worth supporting. Driving back to school after lunch, I made a decision about the next phase of my plan. The 25% reduction had been successful in creating awareness and anxiety without causing genuine hardship. But my family members were still looking for external explanations rather than examining their own behavior and values. They were treating the situation as a temporary administrative problem rather than a fundamental challenge to their assumptions about entitlement and respect. It was time to increase the pressure. The next month's payments would be reduced by 50%, a change significant enough to require serious lifestyle adjustments and force difficult conversations about priorities and values. At that level of reduction, they would no longer be able to maintain their current spending patterns while waiting for the administrative issues to resolve themselves. They would be forced to make choices about what truly mattered to them, what they were willing to sacrifice to maintain appearances, and how they planned to generate income to replace what they were losing from the trust. Most importantly, they would be forced to confront the reality that their comfortable lifestyle had been partially dependent on money they hadn't earned and couldn't control. That evening, I called the trust management company and authorized the additional payment reductions, scheduled to take effect with the following month's distributions. The conversation was brief and professional. The administrators had clear instructions from Aunt Francesca's legal documents about my authority to make such changes, and they implemented my decisions without question or commentary. As I hung up the phone and returned to my painting, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. My family was about to learn what it felt like to be vulnerable, uncertain, and dependent on the goodwill of others. They were about to discover whether their relationships with each other were based on genuine love and support, or simply on shared access to comfortable circumstances. More importantly, they were about to find out what happened when the family member they had dismissed as a plague finally decided to show them what real power looked like. The lesson was just beginning, and I was eager to see how they would respond when their assumptions about security, success, and family loyalty were tested by genuine adversity. The phone calls started 3 days after the second round of payment reductions took effect. This time, there was no pretense of casual inquiry or polite confusion. Isabella called first, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, as she demanded answers about what she was now clearly recognizing as a serious threat to her financial stability. Elena, something is really wrong with the trust payments. This isn't a mistake anymore. Someone is deliberately cutting our money, and I need to know if you have any information about what's happening. Her directness was a dramatic change from her previous carefully casual approach, suggesting that a 50% reduction in her monthly income was impossible to ignore or rationalize as an administrative error. She was no longer trying to maintain her social media persona of effortless success. She was scared, and she wanted answers. That sounds very concerning, I replied with genuine sympathy. Have you been able to get any information from the trust administrators? They keep saying they're following instructions from the primary beneficiary, but they won't tell me who that is or how to contact them. Elena, I need this money. Richard's practice is going through a slow period, and we have commitments that we can't meet without the trust payments. The admission that she and her husband were financially dependent on the family trust was significant. Isabella had always presented her marriage to a successful doctor as evidence of her own achievement and security, but now she was revealing that their lifestyle required external support to maintain. The image of effortless luxury that she projected on social media was apparently much more fragile than her followers realized. Is there anything I can do to help? I asked, knowing that my offer would force her to confront the reality of our relationship and her previous treatment of me. I don't know. Maybe you could talk to Dad about it? Maybe he has some influence with whoever is making these decisions? Her suggestion that I might serve as an intermediary was particularly ironic, given that she was essentially asking me to advocate on her behalf with myself. But it also revealed how completely she misunderstood the power dynamics of the situation. She still couldn't conceive of me as someone with independent authority or resources. I can certainly mention your concerns to Dad, I agreed, though I'm not sure how much influence any of us have over legal and financial matters that are probably controlled by attorneys and trustees. After ending the call with Isabella, I had barely returned to grading papers when Antonio called with his own set of demands and concerns. His approach was more aggressive than his sister's, reflecting both his business background and his growing frustration with being unable to identify and address the source of their financial problems. Elena, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you know anything about these trust payment changes? And I mean anything. Conversations with Dad, communications from lawyers, rumors from other family members, anything at all? His question was more direct than anything my siblings had asked before, suggesting that he was beginning to suspect that the explanation for their difficulties might be closer to home than they had initially assumed. But his phrasing also revealed that he was still thinking in terms of information and influence rather than direct control. I honestly don't have any special information about trust administration, I replied, which was technically true since I hadn't received information. I had inherited authority. Because here's the thing. Victoria is convinced that you're somehow involved in this, and while I told her that was ridiculous, I'm starting to wonder if maybe you heard something that the rest of us missed. His admission that Victoria had been lobbying him to suspect me was interesting. It suggested that she was becoming increasingly convinced of my involvement, despite having no evidence or understanding of how such involvement might be possible. Her intuition was accurate, but her theories about my methods were completely wrong. What does Victoria think I could possibly have done to affect trust payments? I asked, genuinely curious about how she was explaining my supposed influence to her husband. She thinks maybe you complained to Dad about what happened at his birthday party, and maybe he's using his influence to punish our family for how she treated you. It sounds paranoid when I say it out loud, but she's really convinced that the timing isn't coincidental. The irony was overwhelming. Victoria had correctly identified the connection between her attack on me and the subsequent financial problems, but she had completely misunderstood the mechanism. She was looking for complex conspiracies involving family politics and emotional manipulation, when the reality was much simpler. I had direct control over their money, and I was using it. I haven't discussed the birthday party with Dad or anyone else, I said truthfully. And honestly, I think Victoria might be looking for someone to blame because the financial uncertainty is stressful for everyone. Maybe you're right. This whole situation is making everyone paranoid and suspicious. I just wish we could get some clear answers about what's happening and when it might be resolved. His frustration was palpable, and I felt a moment of sympathy for the stress he was experiencing. But then I remembered years of being treated as the family disappointment, months of condescending comments about my career choices, and decades of being made to feel like my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. My sympathy faded quickly. The third call came from Victoria herself, and this time she had abandoned any pretense of politeness or strategic communication. She was angry, scared, and looking for someone to attack as the source of her family's newfound financial vulnerability. I know you're behind this somehow, she began without preamble. I don't know how you're doing it, but I know you're responsible for what's happening to our money. Her certainty was remarkable, considering how wrong she was about everything except the basic fact of my involvement. But her absolute conviction that I was the source of their problems suggested that her intuition about family dynamics was better than her understanding of financial and legal systems. Victoria, I understand you're frustrated and worried, but you're looking for explanations that don't make sense. I don't have any involvement in trust administration or legal decisions about family finances. Then explain the timing. Explain how these problems started right after you had to sit there and listen to me tell you what everyone in the family really thinks about your pathetic life. Her reference to the birthday party incident was crude but accurate. She clearly understood that her public attack on me had been a catalyst for something, even if she couldn't identify what that something might be. But her characterization of my life as pathetic revealed that she still completely misunderstood my circumstances and capabilities. I think you're under a lot of stress right now, and that's making you look for connections that aren't really there, I said calmly. Financial and legal matters don't usually change based on family arguments or hurt feelings. Don't patronize me. I know something changed after that dinner, and I know you're involved somehow. Maybe you're not smart enough to figure out the technical details yourself, but you're vindictive enough to get someone else to help you. Her assumption that I would need assistance to affect their financial situation was revealing. Even when confronting me directly about my supposed responsibility for their problems, she couldn't conceive of me as someone with independent power or resources. In her worldview, someone like me could only operate through manipulation or dependence on others. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Victoria alternating between accusations and demands for confession, while I maintained calm denial and expressed concern for the stress she was obviously experiencing. By the time she hung up, she was even more convinced of my guilt, but no closer to understanding how I might be exercising the influence she was certain I possessed. Over the following weeks, the pressure of reduced trust payments began to affect my family's behavior in ways that were both predictable and revealing. Isabella's social media presence became increasingly focused on partnership deals and sponsored content, as she worked to replace lost income through her influencer activities. Her posts began featuring more budget-friendly options and practical advice, shifting her brand toward accessibility rather than luxury. Antonio took on additional consulting work and began spending longer hours at the family restaurants, generating more personal income to compensate for the reduced trust distributions. His conversations at family gatherings became more focused on financial planning and income diversification, topics he had rarely discussed when his trust payments provided comfortable supplemental income. Victoria's behavior became increasingly erratic as the financial pressure continued. She seemed to be taking the payment reductions as a personal attack, and her interactions with other family members became strained as she searched for allies in her campaign to identify and punish whoever was responsible for their changed circumstances. During family dinners, she made pointed comments about loyalty and respect, clearly attempting to build support for her theory that I was somehow orchestrating their financial difficulties. But her efforts backfired, making other family members uncomfortable with her obvious paranoia and creating exactly the kind of family conflict that she was supposedly trying to prevent. The most significant development came when my father requested another private meeting, this time with obvious urgency about the ongoing trust issues that were affecting his other children. His approach was more direct than our previous conversation, suggesting that the situation had reached a level that required immediate attention and resolution. Elena, I've been doing some research into Francesca's estate and the trust arrangements, and I've discovered some information that I need to discuss with you. His tone was serious but not accusatory, suggesting that he had learned something important but wasn't sure how to interpret it or what action might be required. I felt a moment of anticipation, wondering how much he had discovered and whether he was beginning to understand the true nature of the situation. What kind of information? I asked carefully. It turns out that Francesca made some significant changes to the trust structure before she died. Changes that give primary control to a single beneficiary rather than distributing authority among multiple family members. His words confirmed that he was beginning to understand the legal framework that gave me control over the trust payments, though he clearly hadn't yet realized that I was the beneficiary in question. He was approaching the information as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a reality to be confronted. That sounds complicated, I agreed. Do you know who the primary beneficiary is? That's what I'm trying to figure out. The attorneys have been very circumspect about releasing information, citing privacy requirements and legal confidentiality. But someone has the authority to make decisions about payment distributions, and that someone has been using it. He was clearly hoping that I might have insights or information that could help him identify the mysterious beneficiary who was affecting his children's financial security. The irony of asking me to help him find myself was almost overwhelming, but I maintained my expression of interested concern. Have Antonio and Isabella tried working directly with legal counsel to get more information? They've consulted with attorneys, but apparently the trust documents are very specific about confidentiality and the primary beneficiary's right to privacy. Unless someone volunteers information about their role, it's difficult to identify them through legal channels. His explanation revealed the effectiveness of Aunt Francesca's legal planning. She had clearly anticipated that family members might try to challenge or circumvent the primary beneficiary's authority, and she had structured the trust to prevent such interference while protecting my privacy and decision-making independence. That does sound frustrating for them, I acknowledged, especially when they're trying to understand changes that affect their financial planning. Elena, I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll be completely honest with me. His tone became more serious, and I felt a moment of tension as I prepared for whatever question he was planning to pose. Had he somehow discovered my role in the trust administration? Was he about to confront me with evidence of my control over the payments? Of course, Dad. What do you want to know? If you were the person with authority over these trust payments, if you were the beneficiary making decisions about distributions, would you tell me? His question was both more direct and less informed than I had expected. He was asking hypothetically about my willingness to reveal such information, rather than asserting knowledge that I actually held such authority. But the question itself suggested that he was beginning to consider me as a possible candidate for the mysterious primary beneficiary role. That's an interesting hypothetical question, I replied carefully. I suppose it would depend on the circumstances and the reasons for making such decisions. What I mean is, if you had that kind of authority, and you were using it to reduce payments to Antonio and Isabella, would you discuss it with me as their father and your father? His phrasing revealed that he was not only considering me as a candidate for the beneficiary role, but also trying to understand what motivations might drive such decisions. He was beginning to connect the timing of the payment reductions to family dynamics and relationships, though he clearly wasn't ready to make direct accusations. I think anyone making such decisions would probably want to have good reasons and clear justifications for their choices, I said diplomatically. Family financial matters are complicated because they involve both practical considerations and personal relationships. Elena, I need to ask you directly. Are you the primary beneficiary of Francesca's trust? Are you the person who has been reducing the payments to your siblings? There it was. The direct question I had been expecting eventually. My father had finally connected enough pieces to identify me as the most likely source of his other children's financial difficulties. But his tone was more curious than accusatory, suggesting that he wanted to understand the situation rather than simply assign blame. I looked at this man who had worked so hard to build security for his family, who was now worried about his children's welfare and confused about the changes affecting their lives. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth, explaining Aunt Francesca's intentions and my own motivations for reducing the trust payments. But then I remembered years of being treated as the family disappointment, decades of being made to feel like my choices and values were inferior to those of my siblings. I remembered Victoria's public attack at his birthday party, and the years of condescension that had preceded it. I remembered that he was asking me to explain myself only because his other children were experiencing financial pressure, not because he was concerned about how those children had treated me. Dad, if I were in that position, if I had that kind of responsibility and authority, I hope I would use it wisely and fairly, based on careful consideration of what would be best for everyone involved. My response was carefully non-committal, neither confirming nor denying his suspicions, while suggesting that any decisions would be made thoughtfully rather than vindictively. But I could see in his expression that he was interpreting my evasiveness as confirmation of his theory. I see, he said quietly. And if that were the case, if you were making such decisions, would you be willing to discuss the situation with Antonio and Isabella directly? Would you consider explaining your reasoning to them? His question revealed that he was already thinking beyond the immediate issue of payment reductions to the larger challenge of family relationships and communication. He was concerned not only about his children's financial welfare, but also about the potential for permanent damage to family unity if these issues weren't addressed openly and honestly. I think any conversation like that would need to happen when everyone was ready to listen with open minds and genuine willingness to understand different perspectives, I replied. Sometimes family discussions about difficult topics require preparation and the right circumstances. What would those right circumstances look like? His question suggested that he was willing to facilitate such a conversation, to help create conditions where honest communication might be possible. But it also revealed his assumption that I would ultimately be willing to engage in family dialogue about my decisions and motivations. I think everyone would need to be ready to acknowledge that relationships haven't always been what they should have been, and that changes in circumstances might require changes in behavior and attitudes. My answer was carefully crafted to suggest that any discussion would need to include recognition of how I had been treated by family members, not just explanation of how I was now treating them. If my father wanted to facilitate reconciliation, he would need to understand that it couldn't be based simply on restoring the financial status quo. That seems reasonable, he agreed. Family relationships are complicated, and sometimes we all make mistakes in how we treat each other. His acknowledgement that family members had made mistakes was encouraging, though I noticed that he was speaking in generalities rather than addressing specific incidents or patterns of behavior. Still, it suggested that he was beginning to understand that the current situation might be connected to larger issues of respect and treatment within the family. As our conversation concluded and we prepared to part ways, I felt a complex mixture of emotions about the path forward. My father's approach had been thoughtful and non-accusatory, suggesting that he was genuinely interested in understanding and resolving the situation, rather than simply protecting his other children from consequences. But he was still thinking in terms of restoring harmony and financial stability, rather than addressing the fundamental issues of character and values that had motivated my actions. The conversation had also revealed that my siblings were beginning to experience genuine financial pressure, moving beyond mere inconvenience toward situations that required significant lifestyle adjustments and difficult choices about priorities. The 50% payment reduction was having the intended effect of forcing them to confront their dependence on inherited wealth while creating motivation for honest self-examination. But they were still looking for external solutions rather than internal growth, They were still focused on identifying and neutralizing the source of their problems, rather than examining whether their problems might be reflections of their own character and behavior. The lesson I was trying to teach them hadn't been learned yet, which meant the pressure would need to continue until they were ready to engage in genuine reflection and change. That evening, I made the decision that would transform my family's financial difficulties from temporary inconvenience to permanent reality. Sitting in my studio apartment, surrounded by paintings that represented my authentic self rather than any attempt to meet other people's expectations, I called the trust management company and authorized the complete termination of all monthly distributions to Antonio and Isabella, effective immediately. The conversation with the administrator was brief and professional. Mrs. Henderson, who had been managing Aunt Francesca's affairs for years, simply confirmed my instructions and assured me that the changes would be implemented without delay. She didn't ask for explanations or justifications. My authority as primary beneficiary was absolute, and my decisions were final. As I hung up the phone, I felt a profound sense of completion. For months, I had been implementing a gradual strategy designed to test my family's character and create opportunities for growth and self-reflection. But their responses had consistently demonstrated that they were incapable of learning the lessons I had hoped to teach them. Instead of examining their own behavior and values, they had focused entirely on identifying external sources to blame for their difficulties. The final payment termination wasn't motivated by vindictiveness or anger. It was simply the logical conclusion of an experiment that had revealed everything I needed to know about my siblings' true character. They had failed every test of humility, empathy, and genuine relationship building that their reduced circumstances had provided. They had remained focused on their own comfort and convenience, while showing no curiosity about whether their treatment of me had contributed to their current situation. The phone call started within 48 hours, and this time there was no pretense of politeness or diplomatic inquiry. Isabella called first, her voice shaking with panic as she realized that her financial support had been completely eliminated, rather than simply reduced. "Elena, something terrible has happened. The trust payments stopped completely. No money came through at all this month, and the management company won't give me any information about when it might be restored. I don't know what to do." Her desperation was genuine and heartbreaking in many ways, but it was also revealing. After years of dismissing my modest lifestyle and questioning my priorities, she was now discovering what it felt like to face genuine financial uncertainty. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed her to judge my choices were being stripped away, forcing her to confront the reality of her own vulnerability. "That sounds incredibly stressful," I replied with sincere sympathy. "Are you and Richard able to manage without the trust income?" "No, we can't manage. We have a mortgage, car payments, Isabella's private school tuition, and all sorts of commitments that were based on having that monthly support. Without it, we're going to lose everything." Her admission that their entire lifestyle was dependent on inherited wealth was significant. For years, she had presented her marriage to a successful doctor as evidence of her own achievement and financial security. But now she was revealing that their apparent prosperity was largely illusory, maintained through family money rather than earned income. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked, knowing that my offer would force her to confront the nature of our relationship and her previous treatment of me. "I don't know. Maybe you could talk to whoever is making these decisions. Maybe you could advocate for us with the trust administrators or the legal representatives." Her suggestion that I might serve as her advocate was particularly ironic, since she was essentially asking me to argue with myself on her behalf, but it also revealed how completely she misunderstood the power dynamics of the situation. Even facing financial crisis, she couldn't conceive of me as someone with independent authority or resources. "I'm not sure I have any influence in legal or financial matters like this," I said carefully. "But I hope you're able to find a solution that works for your family. Elena, please. I know we haven't always been as close as we should have been, but we're sisters. Family should help family, especially during emergencies." Her appeal to family loyalty was both touching and hypocritical. She was asking me to demonstrate the kind of familial support that she had never shown me, to prioritize her welfare in ways that she had never prioritized mine. The irony was overwhelming, but I kept my voice gentle and sympathetic. I understand you're scared and looking for any possible source of help. But sometimes these financial and legal situations have to be resolved through official channels rather than personal relationships. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Isabella alternating between panic and pleading, while I maintained expressions of concern without offering any concrete assistance or revealing my role in her circumstances. By the time she ended the call, she was clearly more desperate but no closer to understanding the true source of her problems. Antonio's reaction was more aggressive and business-focused, reflecting his background in commercial enterprises and his frustration with being unable to identify and address the source of their financial crisis. When he called later that same day, his tone was sharp, with barely controlled anger. "Elena, I know you know something about what's happening with the trust payments. This isn't coincidence anymore. Someone with authority over family finances is deliberately targeting Isabella and me, and I need to know who it is and why they're doing it." His directness was refreshing after months of diplomatic dancing around the real issues, but his assumptions about my knowledge and involvement were still fundamentally incorrect. He understood that someone was making deliberate decisions about their financial support, but he remained focused on identifying external enemies rather than examining internal behavior. "I can understand why you'd be looking for explanations," I replied. "Complete termination of expected income would be terrifying for anyone." "It's not just terrifying, it's financially devastating. We have obligations and commitments that can't be met without that money. Whoever is doing this is essentially trying to destroy our lives." His characterization of the situation as an attack on his family was revealing. In his worldview, the elimination of inherited financial support was equivalent to deliberate destruction, suggesting that he had never considered the possibility that such support might be conditional on behavior, relationships, or demonstrated worthiness. "Have you been able to get any information from legal representatives or financial advisors about your options?" I asked. "Everyone keeps referring us back to the primary beneficiary, but nobody will identify who that is or provide contact information. It's like we're being deliberately kept in the dark while someone with power over our lives makes decisions that affect our entire future." His frustration with the confidentiality protections built into Aunt Francesca's trust structure was understandable but also ironic. He was experiencing exactly the kind of powerlessness and uncertainty that I had felt for years, when family members made decisions about my life and circumstances without consulting me or considering my preferences. "That does sound very frustrating," I agreed. "Not having control over your own financial security must be incredibly stressful. Elena, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest with me." His tone became more serious and focused, suggesting that he was preparing to confront me with whatever theory he had developed about my involvement in their situation. I felt a moment of anticipation, wondering whether he had finally connected enough pieces to understand the reality of our circumstances. "What do you want to know? Are you the primary beneficiary? Are you the person who has been controlling our trust payments?" His question was direct and unambiguous, demanding the kind of honest answer that our family had rarely exchanged during years of polite surface conversations and carefully maintained pretenses. The moment felt like a turning point where continued evasion would be more dishonest than protective. "Yes," I said simply. "I inherited control of the trust when Aunt Francesca died." The silence that followed my admission was profound and loaded with implications that both of us were still processing. Antonio had suspected the truth, but hearing it confirmed transformed his understanding of our family dynamics and his own position within them. He was no longer dealing with mysterious external forces. He was confronting the consequences of how he had treated a family member who now held power over his financial welfare. "You've been deliberately cutting our payments," he said slowly. "You've been systematically destroying our financial security because you're angry about something." His interpretation of my actions as vindictive punishment revealed that he still didn't understand the deeper issues at stake. He was thinking in terms of family conflict and personal revenge, rather than examining whether his treatment of me might have justified changes in financial support. "I've been making decisions about trust distributions based on my assessment of recipients' character and behavior," I corrected. Aunt Francesca gave me complete discretionary authority because she wanted someone to evaluate whether continued payments were appropriate. Character and behavior? What the hell does that mean? We're your family, Elena. We've always been there for you. His assertion that they had always been supportive was so far from reality that it would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. For years, I had been treated as the family disappointment, excluded from meaningful conversations and made to feel like my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Antonio, when have you ever been there for me? When have any of you treated me as someone whose feelings and welfare mattered as much as your own? My questions hung in the air between us, challenging him to provide examples of the family support he claimed to have offered. But we both knew that he couldn't identify instances of genuine care or inclusion that hadn't been motivated by obligation or social expectation. We included you in family gatherings, we invited you to celebrations, we always made sure you felt welcome at important events. His examples of family support were exactly the kind of surface-level inclusion that demonstrated the problem rather than refuting it. He was describing tolerance and polite accommodation rather than genuine affection or respect for my choices and values. You invited me to events where I was made to feel like an outsider, where my lifestyle was constantly criticized, where my career choices were treated as evidence of failure or lack of ambition. That's not how we saw it. We were concerned about your financial security, worried that you weren't building the kind of future that would give you stability and comfort. His reframing of their criticism as concern was typical of the way my family had justified their dismissive treatment over the years. They had convinced themselves that their disapproval of my choices was motivated by love rather than judgment, care rather than condescension. Your concern was never about my happiness or fulfillment. It was about your embarrassment at having a family member who didn't meet your standards of success and ambition. Elena, if you wanted more support or inclusion, you should have said something. You should have told us how you were feeling instead of bottling it up and then punishing us financially. His suggestion that I should have requested better treatment was particularly frustrating. For years, I had tried to participate more fully in family activities, had attempted to share my interests and achievements, had made efforts to connect with relatives who consistently made it clear that my presence was peripheral to their real concerns. I did try to tell you, in dozens of different ways. But you were never interested in hearing about my life, unless it involved acknowledging failure or seeking help. That's not true. We always asked about your work, your students, your art projects. You asked polite questions, and then changed the subject to topics you found more interesting. You never showed genuine curiosity about my life, or respect for my choices. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Antonio alternating between anger and pleading as he tried to understand how our family relationships had deteriorated to the point where I was willing to eliminate his financial security. But his focus remained consistently on restoring the payments rather than examining the behavior that had motivated their termination. When he finally ended the call, promising to discuss the situation with Isabella and other family members, I felt both relief and sadness. Relief that the pretense and evasion were finally over, that my role in their circumstances was no longer secret. But sadness that even direct confrontation with the consequences of their behavior hadn't prompted any genuine self-reflection or acknowledgement of how they had failed as family members. Victoria's call came that evening, and her approach was characteristically dramatic and confrontational. She had clearly learned about my admission to Antonio, and she was prepared for full-scale war rather than diplomatic negotiation. I knew it was you, you vindictive bitch. I knew you were behind our financial problems from the very beginning. Her opening attack was crude, but also revealing. She was taking credit for intuitive understanding that had actually been based on paranoid suspicion rather than accurate analysis. She had been convinced of my guilt without understanding my methods, motives, or legal authority. I can understand why you're angry and scared, I replied calmly. Losing expected income is always stressful. Don't patronize me. You've been systematically destroying my family's financial security because you couldn't handle hearing the truth about your pathetic life. Her characterization of my life as pathetic was particularly ironic, given that I now controlled more wealth than she could imagine while she was facing genuine financial crisis due to her dependence on money she hadn't earned. Victoria, if you want to have a conversation about family relationships and financial decisions, I'm willing to listen. But if you're just calling to attack me personally, this isn't going to be productive. I want you to restore our payments immediately. I want you to stop this vindictive campaign against people who have never done anything to deserve this kind of treatment. Her demand for immediate restoration of financial support, combined with her assertion that they had done nothing to deserve consequences, revealed that she had learned nothing from months of reduced payments and financial pressure. She was still thinking in terms of entitlement rather than accountability. The trust payments were always discretionary, based on the primary beneficiary's judgment about appropriate use of family resources. Family resources that should be distributed fairly among family members, not used as weapons by someone who's bitter about her own failures. Her understanding of fairness was interesting. She seemed to believe that inherited wealth should be distributed automatically regardless of behavior, relationships, or demonstrated worthiness. The idea that financial support might be conditional on treating other family members with respect was apparently foreign to her worldview. Aunt Francesca specifically structured the trust to give the primary beneficiary complete authority over distributions, because she wanted someone to evaluate whether recipients were demonstrating the values and character that justified continued support. Values and character? You mean like supporting family members during difficult times? Like including everyone in family celebrations? Like caring about each other's welfare and success? Her examples of values and character were exactly the behaviors that my family had failed to demonstrate toward me, but she was presenting them as evidence of their own virtue, rather than acknowledging their absence from our actual relationships. Victoria, when have you ever supported me during difficult times? When have you ever shown interest in my welfare or success that wasn't motivated by obligation or social expectation? We've always been there for you. We included you in every family gathering. We asked about your life. We showed interest in your work. Her claims of support were the same superficial examples that Antonio had offered. Inclusion that felt more like tolerance, questions that felt more like polite obligation than genuine curiosity. Including me in gatherings where I was made to feel like an outsider doesn't demonstrate support. Asking polite questions and then dismissing my answers doesn't show genuine interest. If you felt excluded or dismissed, that was your perception, not our intention. We always tried to make you feel welcome and valued. Her dismissal of my perceptions as inaccurate, while asserting the purity of their intentions, was typical of the way my family had avoided accountability for years. They had convinced themselves that their motives mattered more than their impact, that their comfort with surface-level relationships justified my discomfort with being held at arm's length. The conversation devolved into accusations and denials, with Victoria becoming increasingly desperate and threatening while I maintained calm explanations of my decision-making process and the legal authority that supported my choices. By the time she hung up, she was promising to pursue legal action and family intervention to restore their payments, though she had no understanding of the ironclad protections Aunt Francesca had built into the trust structure. Over the following days, my family's response to the complete termination of trust payments revealed the full extent of their financial dependence and the shallowness of their apparent prosperity. Isabella's social media presence virtually disappeared, as she could no longer afford the lifestyle that had been the foundation of her influencer brand. Her sponsored content shifted toward budget products and discount services, but even those partnerships began declining as her engagement rates dropped with her reduced posting frequency. Antonio was forced to sell his luxury vehicles and downsize his family's housing, moving from their impressive mansion to a modest suburban home that better matched his actual earned income. His role in the family restaurant business expanded by necessity as he worked to replace the lost trust income, but the additional hours and responsibility clearly stressed both his marriage and his health. Victoria's reaction was the most dramatic and destructive. She seemed unable to accept that their financial circumstances had changed permanently, continuing to spend as if the trust payments would be restored while accumulating debt that threatened their remaining assets. Her relationship with Antonio became increasingly strained as she blamed him for failing to resolve the situation and demanded that he find ways to force me to change my decision. The family gathering that had been planned for my father's birthday became a summit meeting focused entirely on developing strategies to address their financial crisis. I was not invited, which was actually a relief, since it allowed me to observe their response to adversity without having to participate in discussions that would inevitably focus on pressuring me to restore their payments. But my father requested another private meeting, and this time his approach was different from our previous conversations. He seemed to have processed the reality of my control over the trust and was prepared to engage with me as someone with legitimate authority, rather than someone who might have information or influence that could be useful. Elena, I need to understand your reasoning for terminating the trust payments to Antonio and Isabella. I need to know whether this decision is permanent, or whether there are conditions under which the payments might be restored. His directness was refreshing after months of diplomatic dancing around the real issues, and his acknowledgement of my authority was a significant change from his previous approach. He was finally treating me as the decision-maker rather than as a potential source of information about mysterious external forces. The payments were terminated because I don't believe Antonio and Isabella have demonstrated the character and values that justify continued financial support. What specific behaviors or actions led you to that conclusion? His question suggested that he was genuinely interested in understanding my perspective, rather than simply advocating for his other children's welfare. It was the first time any family member had asked me to explain my reasoning rather than simply demanding that I change my decisions. Years of being treated as the family disappointment, of having my choices and values consistently dismissed, of being made to feel like my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Can you give me specific examples? I want to understand exactly what happened that made you feel excluded or disrespected. His request for specifics was both encouraging and challenging. Encouraging because it suggested genuine interest in my experience, but challenging because it required me to articulate patterns of behavior that had been subtle but consistent over many years. The way conversations always shifted to other topics when I tried to share news about my work or achievements. The way my gift contributions to family celebrations were always acknowledged politely, but compared unfavorably to more expensive presents. The way my lifestyle choices were constantly questioned and criticized rather than respected as valid alternatives to your definition of success. I can see how those experiences would be hurtful and alienating. I may not have been as aware as I should have been of how those dynamics were affecting you. His acknowledgement of my experience was more validation than I had received from any family member in years, and it gave me hope that at least one relationship might be capable of genuine repair and growth. The final incident was Victoria's public attack at your birthday party, where she called me a plague on the family in front of guests and relatives. That crystallized everything I had been feeling about my place in this family's hierarchy of importance. I remember that incident, and I was horrified by Victoria's behavior. I should have addressed it more directly at the time, instead of letting it pass without consequences. His admission that he had failed to defend me during that humiliating moment was significant, suggesting that he understood how his passivity had contributed to the problem, even if he hadn't been the primary source of disrespectful treatment. Dad, the issue isn't just individual incidents or specific comments. It's a pattern of behavior that demonstrated consistently that my happiness and dignity mattered less than everyone else's comfort and convenience. I can see that now, though I wish I had been more aware of these dynamics while they were developing. What would it take for you to consider restoring some level of financial support to Antonio and Isabella? His question revealed that he was still thinking in terms of negotiation and conditional restoration, rather than understanding that my decision had been based on fundamental assessments of character that wouldn't change simply because of financial pressure. It would require genuine acknowledgement of how they treated me, authentic apologies that demonstrated real understanding of the harm they caused, and sustained behavioral changes that showed respect for my choices and values. And if they were willing to do those things, if they could demonstrate genuine remorse and commitment to better relationships, then we could discuss whether they had learned anything meaningful from this experience. But their focus so far has been entirely on restoring their payments rather than examining their own behavior. Would you be willing to meet with them to discuss these issues directly? Would you consider giving them an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of acknowledgement and change you're looking for? His suggestion of a family meeting was both appealing and concerning. Appealing because it might provide an opportunity for genuine communication and relationship repair, but concerning because I suspected that any such meeting would focus on negotiating financial restoration rather than addressing the deeper issues of respect and character. I would be willing to meet with them if they were genuinely prepared to examine their own behavior and make authentic apologies. But if the meeting is just an attempt to manipulate me into restoring payments, it won't be productive. How would you know the difference? How could you tell whether their approach was genuine or strategic? His question was insightful and difficult to answer definitively. After years of superficial relationships and diplomatic communication, it would be challenging to distinguish between authentic change and calculated performance designed to achieve financial objectives. I suppose I would need to see evidence of understanding and empathy that went beyond their immediate self-interest. I would need to hear acknowledgement of specific behaviors and their impact, not just general apologies for misunderstandings. That seems reasonable. Would you be willing to give them the opportunity to demonstrate that kind of understanding? His persistence suggested that he was genuinely committed to facilitating family reconciliation, though I remained skeptical about my siblings' capacity for the kind of honest self-examination that meaningful change would require. I'll consider it, but only if they approach the conversation with genuine humility rather than entitlement. If they're still focused on what they deserve from me rather than what they owe me, there's no point in meeting. Our conversation concluded with tentative plans for my father to speak with Antonio and Isabella about the possibility of a family meeting focused on relationship repair rather than financial negotiation. I left feeling cautiously optimistic that at least one family member was beginning to understand the deeper issues at stake, though I remained doubtful about my siblings' capacity for meaningful change. The meeting took place 3 weeks later at my father's house, in the same dining room where Victoria had launched her attack months earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us. We were returning to the scene of the incident that had catalyzed my decision to use my inherited power to force accountability for years of dismissive treatment. Antonio and Isabella arrived with obviously prepared statements and carefully controlled emotions, suggesting that they had spent considerable time strategizing about how to approach the conversation. Victoria was notably absent, apparently having been excluded from the meeting due to her inability to engage constructively with the situation. Elena, we want to start by acknowledging that we haven't been the family members we should have been, Antonio began, with the formal tone of someone delivering a rehearsed speech. We recognize that our behavior toward you has been dismissive and disrespectful, and we apologize for making you feel excluded and undervalued. His apology was technically accurate, but felt scripted and impersonal, lacking the specific understanding and emotional authenticity that would suggest genuine insight into the harm they had caused. It was the kind of statement that could have been crafted by a public relations professional, rather than emerging from honest self-reflection. We realize now that we took your presence in our lives for granted, Isabella added, her voice carrying what seemed like genuine emotion, but might have been calculated performance. We should have shown more interest in your work and your achievements instead of always focusing on our own concerns. Her addition to Antonio's apology was more specific and personal, acknowledging actual behaviors rather than speaking in generalities about respect and inclusion. But like her brother's statement, it felt carefully prepared, rather than spontaneously heartfelt. I appreciate that you've taken time to think about our relationships and to prepare these statements, I replied carefully. But I need to understand whether you're apologizing because you genuinely recognize the harm you caused, or because you want to restore your trust payments. The silence that followed my question was telling. Both of my siblings looked uncomfortable with the directness of my challenge, clearly not having expected me to question the sincerity of their carefully prepared apologies. We're apologizing because we realize we were wrong, Antonio said finally. We should have treated you better, regardless of any financial considerations. Then you won't mind if the trust payments remain terminated while we work on rebuilding our relationships based on mutual respect, rather than financial dependence? My question was a test of their true priorities, designed to determine whether they were capable of valuing family relationships independently of the financial benefits those relationships might provide. Their reaction would reveal whether their apologies were motivated by genuine remorse or strategic calculation. Elena, we do need the financial support, Isabella admitted with obvious reluctance. Our lives have been structured around having that income, and without it, were facing serious hardship. Her honesty about their financial desperation was more authentic than their prepared apologies, and it revealed the fundamental tension between their need for money and their need for restored relationships. "So your apologies are conditional on financial restoration," I observed. "You're sorry for how you treated me, but only if being sorry results in resumed payments." "That's not what we're saying," Antonio protested. "We genuinely regret how we've acted toward you, but we also hope that acknowledging our mistakes might lead to some consideration of our current circumstances." His attempt to separate their apologies from their financial needs was unconvincing, particularly given that they had shown no interest in examining our relationships until their payments were terminated. "Antonio, Isabella, for years you treated me as someone whose feelings and welfare were less important than your own. You dismissed my choices, criticized my values, and made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Now you want me to prioritize your welfare and financial security above my own judgment about what you deserve. We understand that we made mistakes," Isabella said quietly. "We want to do better going forward. What would doing better look like? What specific changes would you make in how you treat me and view my choices?" My question was intended to move beyond general promises toward concrete commitments that could be evaluated and measured over time. If they were genuinely committed to change, they should be able to articulate specific behavioral modifications. "We would include you more meaningfully in family activities," Antonio offered. "We would ask about your life and actually listen to your answers instead of just being polite. We would stop questioning your career choices and lifestyle decisions," Isabella added. "We would respect that you've chosen a path that makes you happy even if it's different from what we would choose." Their suggestions were appropriate but still felt like negotiation tactics rather than authentic insights into the changes that meaningful relationship repair would require. They were offering to modify their behavior to meet my stated requirements rather than demonstrating genuine understanding of why such changes were necessary. Those changes would be a good start, I acknowledged, but they would need to be sustained over time and demonstrated through actions rather than just promised in conversation. "How long would we need to demonstrate these changes before you would consider restoring some level of financial support?" Antonio asked, revealing that he was still thinking in terms of earning back their payments rather than rebuilding relationships for their own value. "The trust payments aren't rewards for good behavior," I explained. "They're discretionary distributions based on my assessment of recipients' character and values. If you change how you treat me because you want money, that doesn't demonstrate character. It demonstrates calculation. So there's no way for us to earn back the financial support?" Isabella asked with obvious desperation. "There might be eventually, if you could convince me that you had genuinely changed as people, rather than simply modified your behavior to achieve financial objectives." The meeting continued for another hour, with my siblings alternating between promises of behavioral change and appeals for financial mercy, while I maintained my position that trust distributions were conditional on demonstrated character rather than negotiated agreements. By the time we concluded, it was clear that while they understood intellectually what I wanted to hear, they remained fundamentally unable to separate relationship repair from financial restoration. Over the following months, Antonio and Isabella made obvious efforts to include me more meaningfully in family activities and to show interest in my work and achievements. Their attempts were sometimes awkward and clearly effortful, but they represented genuine changes from their previous patterns of benign neglect and subtle criticism. Isabella began featuring some of my artwork in her social media posts, describing me as her talented artist sister, rather than simply acknowledging my presence at family gatherings. Antonio invited me to contribute ideas for restaurant decor and marketing campaigns, treating my artistic expertise as valuable rather than irrelevant to serious business concerns. These changes were encouraging and suggested that they were capable of treating me with more respect and recognition when they were motivated to do so. But they were also obviously strategic, designed to demonstrate the kind of behavioral modifications that might convince me to restore their financial support. The test of their sincerity came 6 months later, when I received an offer to display my artwork in a prestigious gallery exhibition that would significantly advance my artistic career. The opportunity was exactly the kind of achievement that I had hoped my family would celebrate and support, representing recognition of my talents from the broader art community. When I shared the news at our next family dinner, expecting congratulations and expressions of pride, The response revealed everything I needed to know about whether my siblings had genuinely changed or were simply performing better behavior. "That's wonderful, Elena," Antonio said with polite enthusiasm that felt practiced rather than spontaneous. "Will this help with your financial situation at all? I mean, do these exhibitions typically lead to sales or other income opportunities?" His immediate focus on the financial implications of my artistic achievement, rather than its significance for my personal fulfillment and professional development, revealed that he was still thinking about my life primarily in terms of economic productivity rather than intrinsic value. "It's more about artistic recognition and professional development than immediate income," I replied, watching to see whether he could appreciate success that wasn't measured in dollars. "Still, it's good to see you getting some validation for all the time you've invested in your art," Isabella added, her tone carrying the subtle condescension that suggested she viewed my career as a hobby that occasionally produced amusing results. Their responses were polite and technically supportive, but they lacked the genuine enthusiasm and pride that family members should feel when someone they love achieves something meaningful. They were going through the motions of appropriate reactions without demonstrating real understanding of why this opportunity mattered to me. The conversation quickly shifted to other topics: Antonio's latest business developments, Isabella's new sponsorship deals, family scheduling, and logistics. My artistic achievement became a brief acknowledgement before the discussion returned to subjects that the family found more interesting and relevant. Driving home that evening, I realized that my siblings had learned to perform better behavior without developing genuine respect for my choices and values. They had modified their treatment of me enough to avoid obvious criticism, but they remained fundamentally unable to see my life as equally valid and worthy of celebration as their own achievements. The final confirmation of their unchanged character came during a conversation I overheard between Antonio and Isabella while cleaning up after dinner. I had returned to the dining room to retrieve my purse and heard them talking in the kitchen, clearly assuming I had already left. "Do you think she's buying the supportive family member act?" Isabella asked in a voice that carried exhaustion and frustration. "I don't know, but we can't keep this up forever. It's exhausting having to pretend to be interested in her paintings and her students all the time. I just hope she decides to restore some of the payments soon. Richard's practice is struggling, and we really need that income to avoid losing the house. Maybe we should try a different approach. Maybe Dad could talk to her about family obligation and the importance of taking care of each other." Their conversation revealed that the past 6 months of improved behavior had been a deliberate performance designed to manipulate me into restoring their financial support. They were still thinking of me as someone to be managed and deceived, rather than someone deserving of genuine respect and consideration. Standing in that doorway, listening to my siblings discuss their strategy for exploiting my desire for better family relationships, I felt a profound sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. They had failed every test of character and authenticity that their circumstances had provided. They had proven themselves incapable of genuine change or honest self-reflection. The next morning, I called my attorney and authorized the establishment of a new trust structure that would permanently remove Antonio and Isabella as beneficiaries, while directing the family wealth toward charitable organizations and educational initiatives that reflected Aunt Francesca's values and my own priorities. The conversation with Sarah Chen was brief and professional. She had been expecting this development, having observed my family's response to the payment terminations and their subsequent attempts at reconciliation. "Mrs. Castellano, I want to make sure you understand that this decision is permanent and irreversible. Once we restructure the trust as a charitable foundation, your siblings will have no legal claim to any distributions, regardless of future circumstances or changed behavior. I understand completely. They've had months to demonstrate genuine change and instead chose to perform temporary improvements while plotting to manipulate me into restoring their financial support. Very well. I'll prepare the legal documents to establish the Elena Francesca Castellano Foundation, focused on arts education and support for working-class families pursuing higher education. The foundation structure would ensure that Aunt Francesca's wealth would support people who shared her values of hard work, education, and authentic living, rather than subsidizing the comfortable lifestyles of family members who had never learned to appreciate what they hadn't earned. When the legal changes were finalized and my siblings learned that their financial support had been permanently eliminated rather than temporarily suspended, their reactions revealed the full extent of their entitlement and the shallow nature of their previous apologies. Victoria, despite not being directly affected by the trust payments, led the campaign to challenge my decisions through legal action and family pressure. She organized relatives and business associates to pressure me into reconsidering, arguing that I was destroying family unity and punishing innocent people for minor interpersonal conflicts. Antonio hired attorneys to explore options for contesting the trust modifications, though the legal protections Aunt Francesca had built into the original structure made such challenges futile and expensive. His attempts to find legal remedies revealed that he had never accepted my authority as legitimate, viewing it instead as a technical problem that could be solved through proper legal strategy. Isabella's response was the most manipulative, involving attempts to use her children as emotional leverage to convince me to restore financial support for the sake of my niece and nephew's welfare and educational opportunities. Her willingness to exploit her own children's relationships with me demonstrated the depths of desperation and moral flexibility that financial pressure had revealed. But I remained unmoved by their various appeals, legal challenges, and emotional manipulations. They had been given every opportunity to demonstrate genuine character growth, and had consistently chosen calculation over authenticity, performance over sincerity. The Elena Francesca Castellano Foundation was established with an endowment of $38 million, designed to provide educational scholarships, arts programming, and financial assistance to working families facing economic hardship. The recipients would be people who understood the value of opportunity because they had never taken it for granted, people who would use support to build meaningful lives rather than maintain comfortable lifestyles. 1 year later, I attended the Foundation's first scholarship ceremony, watching as 25 students from working-class backgrounds received funding to pursue college education and artistic training. These young people understood struggle and appreciated assistance in ways my siblings never had. Their gratitude was genuine, their determination inspiring, and their potential unlimited by entitlement or expectation. As I watched these deserving recipients accept their awards, I felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that Aunt Francesca's wealth was finally serving its intended purpose. The money that had once subsidized my family's comfortable complacency was now empowering people who would use opportunity to create meaningful change in their communities and their lives. My siblings had called me a plague on their family, but I had become something far more powerful. I had become the cure for generations of inherited entitlement and unearned privilege. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.